Samuel L. Jackson sat calmly at the view table Thursday morning, dressed in a charcoal jacket and dark-rimmed glasses. The actor, long known for his commanding voice and unapologetic opinions, had come to promote his new film, a historical drama focused on race, power, and reconciliation. The atmosphere was easy at first, with laughter and admiration in equal measure. Whoopi opened warmly. She said, "He's done Shakespeare. He's done Star Wars. He's done Marvel. And now he's doing something a little different. Please welcome the one and only Samuel L. Jackson." The audience erupted in applause. Samuel gave a quiet wave, then nodded respectfully toward each host as he settled in. Joy Behar smiled and said, "You know, every time you come here, I learn something new. But I also wonder what you really think when the cameras are off." Samuel chuckled. He said, "You'd be surprised how little difference there is. What you see is mostly what you get." There was laughter, and for the first 10 minutes, the conversation stayed firmly within the familiar. Whoopi asked about the new film. Sonny Hostin inquired about the preparation process. Alyssa Farah Griffin brought up his longtime support for HBCUs and youth mentorship. The audience leaned in, engaged. Samuel responded thoughtfully. He said, "This story mattered to me because it was honest. It didn't flinch. It didn't sugarcoat. And it reminded people that reconciliation without truth isn't healing. It's denial." The room went quiet in admiration. Sarah Haynes asked, "Do you feel like America's ready to hear that message right now?" Samuel said, "America's ready. The question is whether people in power are willing to listen." That was when the conversation shifted. Sonny leaned in slightly. Her voice was calm, but more direct now. She said, "Samuel, you've spoken out over the years about politics, about injustice. But you've also supported both establishment candidates and grassroots movements. So I'm curious, where do you draw the line? Who really represents your values?" Samuel blinked slowly, considering. He said, "I don't put people in boxes. I vote based on policy, history, consistency, not personality." Sonny nodded, but pressed. She said, "So when you supported President Biden, was that a matter of policy, or just stopping Trump?" Samuel raised an eyebrow. He said, "It was about stopping authoritarianism. I've played villains for decades. I know one when I see one." There was some laughter, but also something sharper underneath it. Alyssa asked next. She said, "But don't you worry that calling your political opponents villains makes the divide worse?" Samuel responded evenly. He said, "You can't heal what you won't name. If someone's undermining democracy, that's not disagreement. That's danger." The room grew quieter. Joy tried to deflect. She said, "Well, I'd watched that movie." But Sonny wasn't done. She said, "What do you say to fans who feel alienated when actors take such strong political positions? People who say, 'I just want to watch a movie, not get a lecture.'" Samuel turned to her, his tone unchanged. He said, "I say they've had a lifetime of comfort. One moment of discomfort won't kill them. The movies are entertainment. But I'm a citizen first." Then it happened. Alyssa leaned forward. Her voice was polite, but the question sharp. She said, "You say you speak for justice. But you've also worked closely with studios that have been accused of discriminatory practices. Do you feel a responsibility to challenge that? Or is that different somehow?" Samuel's face didn't change, but the air around him did. He said, "I've called it out when it mattered. And I've stayed when walking away would have meant fewer voices inside the room." Alyssa said, "But isn't staying also enabling? Isn't silence complicity?" The audience shifted. Samuel said, "If you think I've ever been silent, you haven't been paying attention." Sonny added quietly, "But some would say you've been selective. Outspoken about certain injustices, quieter about others. Particularly when your own industry's involved." Samuel didn't speak right away. He looked at Sonny, then Alyssa, then back at the audience. The tension was building now. He said, "Let me ask you something. Would you say that to Robert Downey Jr.? To Matt Damon? To George Clooney?" Alyssa looked uncertain. She said, "If they were here, maybe." Samuel interrupted, gently but firmly. He said, "No, you wouldn't. Because you don't question white actors the same way. You don't ask them if they've done enough. You let them be artists. I'm the only one here being put on trial. The room went still. Sunny said, "That's not what this is." But Samuel cut her off. Still calm, still composed, but no longer participating. He said, "Yes, it is." Then he took off his microphone. Whoopi stood quickly, confused. She said, "Wait, Samuel, let's talk." But Samuel was already standing. He said, "I came here to talk about a film. About healing. About history. Not to defend my entire career." He nodded once, respectfully. Then he walked off stage. The camera caught the silence. The audience unsure whether to clap. The hosts frozen, looking at each other. Whoopi finally said, "We're going to take a break." And then the screen went black. The View returned from commercial with subdued energy. The table was quieter now. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the center, her hands folded in front of her, as she looked into the camera. There was no music. No applause. Just stillness. Whoopi said, "If you're just joining us, we had actor Samuel L. Jackson with us this morning. He left the stage before the break. And while we respect his decision, I want to acknowledge that this was not the way we hoped this conversation would go." She paused, then turned to Sunny Hostin. Sunny said, "I have enormous respect for Mr. Jackson, and I didn't intend to question his integrity. But I do believe in holding everyone to the same standard, no matter how famous." Joy Behar interjected. She said, "Sure, but there's holding someone accountable, and then there's making them feel ambushed." The man came here to talk about a film. Alyssa Farah Griffin looked uncomfortable. She said, "I asked a tough question, yes. But we've done that with politicians, authors, and activists. Why should artists be exempt?" Whoopi turned to her. She said, "Because artists aren't here campaigning. They're telling stories. And Samuel's been doing that, with truth and courage, for decades." Sarah Haynes spoke next. She said, "I think there's a difference between tough and targeted. And something about the tone felt different today." The table went quiet again. Backstage, producers were trying to reach Samuel's team. A staff member had slipped a note to Whoopi during the break. "He's already left the building." Out front, audience members were whispering, unsure what they had just witnessed. The show moved on to a different topic, but the tension lingered. Each co-host gave their take on celebrity activism, public accountability, and whether certain lines shouldn't be crossed in a daytime setting. But the audience sensed what was really being debated wasn't a policy or a principle. It was a man's dignity. The next morning, clips of the walkout were already viral. The headline trended, "Samuel L. Jackson walks out of the View." But the footage told more than the headline. Viewers saw a man composed, calm, measured. They saw a conversation that had started about race and justice turn into something else. They saw a question framed as accountability feel more like accusation. Commentators were divided. Some said Samuel had overreacted. Others said he'd handled it with grace. A prominent columnist wrote, "What Jackson walked out of wasn't a question. It was a courtroom with no judge and no defense." Later that afternoon, Samuel posted on social media. No video, no hashtags, just one sentence. "When the question is never asked the same way to white actors, it's not journalism. It's scrutiny with a target." The post racked up over 2 million likes in 6 hours. The View didn't respond publicly, but insiders reported producers were quietly scrambling. There was talk of issuing a clarification on Monday's episode. A "regret the way the conversation unfolded" kind of statement. Behind the scenes, co-hosts reportedly disagreed. Whoopi was livid. She believed the moment had crossed a line, not because the question was difficult, but because it had been directed with an assumption of guilt. Joy agreed, though she stayed quieter about it. Sunny stood by the segment, though sources say she later admitted to producers, maybe the timing was wrong. Alyssa was shaken. She hadn't expected Samuel to leave. She reportedly said, "I didn't think he'd take it that way. I thought he'd push back. I didn't expect silence." And that, more than anything, became the story. Not the exit, not the walkout, the silence. Because when Samuel L. Jackson stood up and said nothing more, it echoed louder than any argument could have. The Monday episode of The View opened without the usual laughter. There was no banter about the weekend. No jokes about celebrities or awkward transitions into hot topics. The tone was deliberate, restrained, and quiet. Whoopi Goldberg opened the show with a direct look into the camera. She said, "Before we begin today, we want to take a moment to address what happened last Thursday when actor Samuel L. Jackson walked off our set during a conversation that became more contentious than we anticipated." She glanced to Sunny Hostin, who nodded once. Sunny said, "We ask difficult questions on this show. That's part of our job. But it's also our job to recognize when a question becomes something else. I've had time to reflect, and I understand how my tone may have felt personal rather than principled." Alyssa Farah Griffin added, "I didn't mean to create a hostile moment. But watching the tape, I can see why people felt that way. I regret how the conversation turned." Joy Behar kept her hands clasped. She said simply, "Sometimes when people tell you they're hurt, your job isn't to defend what you said. It's to listen." The audience clapped, gently but firmly. Still, Samuel L. Jackson didn't respond. He hadn't issued a second statement, hadn't posted a follow-up. He had returned to his press tour, but requests to revisit the moment were politely declined. In one brief interview, when asked offhandedly about what happened on The View, he replied with a shrug. He said, "I told the truth. Then I left. That's the whole story." But the audience thought otherwise. Clips of the original exchange kept circulating, not just as viral moments, but as teaching tools. College courses in media ethics began referencing the incident. Commentators dissected the subtle shift, how a question about activism morphed into a veiled critique of character, how tone, timing, and the weight of history changed everything. A podcast host noted, "He didn't walk out because he couldn't answer. He walked out because he already had, for decades. And he wasn't going to be forced to repeat his resume just to justify his presence." In the weeks that followed, The View invited other guests who spoke about race, justice, and activism. But there was a noticeable change in how the conversations unfolded. Less confrontation for the sake of drama. More room for lived experience to speak without needing to pass a test. Producers never confirmed whether Samuel was invited back. Rumors swirled that an apology had been extended privately. But there was no public reconciliation. And maybe there didn't need to be. Because the moment itself had already said everything. A man came to talk about a film rooted in truth. He was met with questions that demanded a defense. He chose to leave rather than debate his dignity. And in doing so, he reminded a national audience of something simple and powerful. Not every answer needs to be shouted. Not every walkout is weakness. Sometimes silence is not the absence of strength. It is strength distilled. And sometimes, the loudest voice in the room is the one that knows when to walk away.